The night was thick with silence, the kind that felt unnatural, as if the world had collectively held its breath. The streets were empty, bathed in the sickly glow of flickering streetlights, stretching in endless solitude before me. My shift had drained every last ounce of energy from my bones, leaving me in that dazed, autopilot state where your mind is awake, but your body moves purely out of routine. I pulled out my phone with sluggish fingers, swiping open the Uber app, the neon glow of the screen stabbing through the darkness like a digital wound. I just needed to get home. 5-star rating, thousands of reviews, no profile picture. Something about that blank icon made my stomach twist, but exhaustion dulled my instincts. I pressed, confirm ride, without a second thought. The response was instantaneous. No searching for drivers, no estimated wait time, just a notification, your driver has arrived. The car, sleek and black, was already there, idling at the curb as if it had been waiting for me long before I even thought about heading home. A thin mist curled around the tires, the kind you don't usually see this late at night, its wispy tendrils snaking across the pavement like something alive. The car's windows were so deeply tinted that I couldn't make out a single detail inside. My stomach knotted a little tighter, but logic quickly suffocated any lingering discomfort. It's just a ride home. I yanked open the back door, expecting the warm, stale air of a car that had been running for too long, but instead, I was hit with an unsettling sterility, not fresh, not musty, just, nothing. Like the inside of a hospital room that had been scrubbed of every human trace. The driver didn't greet me, didn't even turn his head, just gave a single, robotic nod, then pulled away from the curb the moment the door shut behind me. There was something off about the way he drove. The movements were too precise, too calculated, no slight hesitations, no minor corrections, just smooth, mechanical perfection. The engine hummed, unnervingly quiet, like the purr of something watching its prey. I stared at his hands gripping the wheel, fingers stiff and unmoving, the knuckles pale, almost waxen under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. A creeping unease slithered into my gut, its roots coiling tighter with every passing second. I reached for my phone, more out of habit than necessity, but when I glanced at the screen, my stomach dropped. The ETA wasn't counting down. It wasn't decreasing. It was increasing. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease curling in my stomach, but it clung to me like a second skin, a whispering dread pressing its cold fingers against the back of my neck. The driver remained eerily silent, his face turned slightly away, just enough to keep me from getting a good look at him. His posture was unnaturally rigid, shoulders squared, hands locked onto the wheel with an intensity that made the veins in his fingers seem too pronounced, too still. Not once did he check the GPS, not once did he glance at the mirrors. It was as if he already knew exactly where we were going, as if the route had been ingrained into his very existence, like some grotesque internal compass pulling him toward a destination only he understood. The longer I sat in the suffocating quiet of that car, the more my senses sharpened, every tiny detail becoming too loud, too clear, too wrong. The soft hum of the engine wasn't accompanied by the usual vibrations of a moving vehicle, as if the car was simply gliding through space, rather than rolling on pavement. The streetlights flickered past the windows in a rhythmic pattern, a sequence so perfectly timed that I felt an uneasy tickle at the back of my brain, like I was watching a looped video instead of reality. Something in me shifted, a deep, primal instinct slamming its way to the surface, demanding that I pay attention. The moment I reached for my phone again, my heart stuttered. The ETA hadn't changed. Not a single second had ticked off, even though we had been driving for several minutes now. My throat tightened as I stared at the numbers, expecting them to update, but they remained frozen, like a glitch in a broken system. I looked up, swallowing the sharp tang of fear creeping into my mouth, and that's when I noticed it, we weren't on the right road anymore. The familiar city streets had disappeared, swallowed by an endless stretch of darkened asphalt flanked by towering, unbroken lines of trees. I didn't recognize this place. It didn't even look real, the trees weren't moving, the road wasn't curving, everything was perfectly still. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned my gaze toward the driver, finally forcing myself to speak. I think you missed a turn." My voice sounded brittle, like a dry twig snapping in the eerie quiet. The driver didn't react. He didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge that I had spoken at all. My pulse pounded against my ribs, a steady hammering beat that suddenly felt too loud, too alive, too human in this dead, silent car. I licked my lips, forcing out a nervous chuckle. "Hey, man, you sure this is the right way? I can just," but before I could finish, he did something that shattered every sense of safety I had left. His head, stiff and unnatural, turned too slowly, too precisely, like a doll's head being twisted on a rusted hinge. And then, for the first time since I got in the car, he spoke. "You are almost home." The words left his mouth in a voice that wasn't right. It was my voice. A perfect, hollow, distorted imitation of my own voice. My entire body went rigid, every nerve frozen in place as the echo of my own voice hung in the stagnant air, twisting and stretching in a way that sounded almost right, but not quite. It had the same tone, the same cadence, but something beneath it was off, like a recording being played back on a broken speaker. My throat tightened as I stared at the driver, my breath catching in my chest, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. My skin prickled with cold terror, an instinctual reaction clawing at the base of my skull, screaming at me to run, escape, get out now. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The driver's head had turned just enough for me to see the side of his face, but something was horribly, monstrously wrong. His skin didn't sit on his bones the way it should. It looked too smooth, too tight, as if it had been stretched over his skull like an ill-fitting mask. His cheekbones were sharp, unnatural, and his mouth was still moving, forming the words, "You are almost home," even though the sound had already stopped. I swallowed thickly, my fingers tightening around my phone, my only connection to the real world. I needed to get out of this car. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breathing coming in short, uneven gasps as I forced myself to glance at the road ahead. We were still moving, but the scenery, it wasn't changing. The trees outside the window stood perfectly still, their branches not swaying, their leaves unnaturally frozen in place. The streetlights passed by in the exact same intervals, flickering in a rhythm so precise it felt programmed. The realization hit me like ice water down my spine, this wasn't just a wrong turn. This wasn't even a road I recognized anymore. I turned back to the driver, my voice strained with barely controlled fear. "Stop the car," I demanded, forcing my tone to stay steady even as my insides twisted with panic. He didn't react. His hands remained locked on the wheel, his head still turned at that impossible angle, his lips frozen in that unnerving, delayed movement. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached for the door handle, fingers wrapping around the cold metal, ready to fling it open, to hurl myself into the dark if I had to. But the moment I pulled, nothing. The door didn't budge. I yanked harder, my breath coming in quick, frantic bursts, but the handle stayed rigid, completely unmovable. Panic roared through me as I clawed at the lock, pressing every button I could find, but the door wouldn't open. I turned back to the driver, fear sharpening into desperation. "Stop the damn car!" I shouted, slamming my fist against the back of his seat. And then, he moved. Not like a normal person, not like someone reacting to a noise or a sudden impact. He moved like a puppet, his limbs jerking in an unnatural, segmented motion, his head snapping forward so quickly I heard the sickening crack of his neck. And then, for the first time since I'd gotten in the car, he turned to face me completely. I wish he hadn't. His eyes, if you could even call them that, weren't human. They were completely black, not just the irises, but the entire sockets, like two gaping voids where a soul should have been. And in the reflection of those empty, endless pits, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't me. The person staring back from his eyes wasn't me. It was someone else entirely. Someone I didn't recognize. Someone whose mouth was stretched open in a silent scream. I couldn't breathe. The sight of that distorted, gaping scream reflected in the driver's soulless black eyes made my skin feel too tight, my bones too fragile, my very existence suddenly unstable. I yanked my gaze away, my mind refusing to process what I had just seen, but the sheer weight of that twisted, impossible reality settled deep in my gut like a toxin spreading through my veins. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, the last tether I had to anything remotely normal. My pulse pounded beneath my skin, a frantic rhythm that only worsened when I saw the screen. My signal was gone. Not weak, not barely holding on. Completely, utterly gone. The Wi-Fi symbol had disappeared, the battery percentage frozen at 67%, the time no longer changing. 2:37 a.m. The exact moment I had requested the ride. Something wasn't just wrong, I was no longer in the world I knew. The car, the road, the air itself felt like a decayed reflection of reality, as if I had stepped into something else's version of it. I forced my breath to steady, trying to convince myself that I still had some kind of control, but the longer I sat there, the more I realized the truth, I wasn't going anywhere. The car was still moving, the trees outside blurring past in a seamless, looping pattern, but we weren't getting any closer to home. I turned sharply, pressing my face against the window, looking for any break in the scenery, any sign of movement, a single gust of wind, a bird, a plane, anything that proved this world was still alive. But there was nothing. Then, a cold, mechanical voice rang through the silence. Not the driver's voice. Something else. Something deeper. The dashboard screen, which had remained blank this entire ride, flickered to life with a dull, greenish glow. My breath hitched as words formed on the screen, the letters sharp, clinical, calculated. Error, passenger may not exit. My stomach twisted violently, my grip tightening around the useless phone, my heartbeat a deafening drum against my ribs. Not an error. Not a glitch. A command. The car wasn't just refusing to stop, it wasn't letting me leave. I turned toward the driver, my voice hoarse and raw from the fear choking my throat. What the hell is this? I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of sheer terror. He didn't answer. He didn't even move. But his reflection in the rearview mirror? It was still staring at me. I felt my breath lock in my chest, my lungs refusing to work as my mind wrestled with the horrifying impossibility of what I was seeing. The driver's head was motionless, perfectly still, facing the road ahead. But in the rearview mirror, his reflection was staring directly at me. His black, hollow eyes pulsed with something unnatural, something that slithered in the darkness behind them, shifting like an entity separate from the man himself. My pulse pounded violently against my temples, each frantic heartbeat hammering home the reality that whatever was sitting in the front seat of this car was not human. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the nightmare to end, but the moment I opened them, my stomach lurched into my throat. The reflection was grinning now. The mouth that stretched across his face in the mirror was wrong, a grotesque, exaggerated imitation of a human smile, pulled too wide, the corners of his lips nearly reaching his ears. His teeth, too numerous, too sharp, too predatory, gleamed under the dim light of the dashboard, each one pointed like the maw of a creature designed to tear through flesh. My fingers trembled as I dug them into the fabric of the seat beneath me, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something other than just sit there frozen in blind terror. My breath shuddered out in ragged gasps, the air around me suddenly feeling thicker, heavier, like the inside of the car had sealed itself off from the rest of the world. Then, slowly, mechanically, the driver's real head began to turn, mirroring the movement in the reflection, but there was no transition, no in-between. One moment, his head was forward. The next, it was facing me completely. His neck twisted at an impossible angle, no muscles shifting, no bones cracking, just an unnatural, seamless rotation that defied everything I knew about the way the human body should move. His eyes, empty and void-like, consumed everything they touched, sucking the light straight from the air, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer an imitation of mine. It was something else entirely, a sound that didn't belong in this world. "We are almost home." The words weren't spoken, they were felt, vibrating through my ribcage, resonating inside my skull as if the car itself had whispered them into existence. And in that moment, I knew, I wasn't a passenger anymore. I was prey. The weight of the driver's words settled into my chest like an anchor, thick and suffocating, wrapping around my ribs with a pressure that felt wrong, not physical, but something deeper, something inside me, pressing against the edges of my sanity. My skin crawled as his black, hollow eyes bored into mine, unblinking, as if he was waiting for something. My fingers dug into the fabric of my jeans, my breath hitching as I forced myself to look away, to break the connection before whatever was inside him could see too far into me. My heart pounded against my ribs like it was trying to escape my body, like it knew something I didn't. I clenched my fists, sucking in a sharp breath, willing myself to move, to fight the paralyzing terror coursing through me like venom. I needed to do something, anything. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw them. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, twisting shadows into shapes, warping the dim glow of the dashboard into something sinister. But as my eyes focused, my breath left my body in a single, strangled exhale. The back seat, which I had been sitting in alone just moments ago, wasn't empty anymore. There were people there. Pale figures, their faces frozen in expressions of silent, vacant horror. Their mouths were slightly open, lips cracked and dry, as if they had tried to scream but never found the air to do so. Their eyes, wide, glassy, lifeless, stared straight ahead, unblinking, unfocused, empty. The longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't breathing. I turned my head sharply, my stomach twisting violently as I braced for the worst, but the back seat was empty. No one was there. Just darkness. Just silence. But in the mirror, they were still there. I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw ached, my pulse roaring in my ears, the rhythmic drumming of my heartbeat nearly drowning out the unnatural silence that filled the car like a living, breathing entity. My trembling hand reached forward on instinct, fingers hovering just above the surface of the mirror, my own reflection barely recognizable beneath the sheer terror contorting my features. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to believe. But I had to. Just as my fingertip grazed the glass, one of the passengers turned their head toward me. Their lips moved. No sound. No whisper. Just the slow, unnatural forming of a word, their mouth twisting to create a shape I couldn't quite understand, couldn't fully comprehend, until suddenly, in the dead silence of the car, I heard it. A voice. Not from them. Not from the driver. Not from me. It came from everywhere. And it said, "You should not be here." My entire body locked up at the sound of that voice, deep, hollow, vibrating through my bones like the echo of something ancient and starving. It wasn't coming from the driver, nor the passengers in the mirror. It was coming from everywhere at once. From the air itself. From the car. From inside my own skull. My vision blurred as cold, paralyzing fear twisted around my lungs, making each breath feel like suffocating on ice. My fingers curled into the seat, my knuckles whitening as I forced myself to move, to fight the unnatural stillness trying to settle over me like a coffin lid being nailed shut. With a sharp inhale, I yanked my gaze away from the mirror, from the motionless figures frozen in their silent horror, from the twisting mouth that had spoken without sound. My muscles screamed as I lunged for the door handle, fingers scrambling over the cold metal, pulling, jerking, slamming my shoulder against the frame, desperate to get out, out, out. But the door didn't budge. Not even an inch. The lock wasn't stuck, it was as if there was no mechanism at all, as if the door was just a solid, immovable part of the car's frame. My chest heaved, panic clawing up my throat like a living thing, my thoughts spinning wildly, frantically searching for an escape. I turned to the window, raising my elbow, ready to smash the glass with everything I had. But before I could, I saw something in the reflection. Not my own panicked face, not the frozen passengers, but the driver. His mouth was still stretched into that grotesque, lipless grin, but now, his head was moving. Slowly, stiffly, his neck bent backward, vertebrae cracking, twisting at an impossible angle until his face was upside down, staring at me from an inhuman position. The movement was slow, deliberate, excruciatingly unnatural, like something that had worn human skin for far too long and had forgotten how to move like one. His hollow eyes glowed in the reflection, black pits that weren't just empty, but hungry. And then, without moving his lips, he spoke directly into my mind. "You cannot leave." My breath hitched in my throat, my entire body locking up as a sudden, invisible weight pressed against me from every side. The air thickened, congealed, crushing me, sinking me deeper into the seat, trapping me in a grip that wasn't physical, but something far worse. My vision blurred at the edges, the world warping, my thoughts fracturing beneath the overwhelming force of something I couldn't comprehend. My hands twitched, my body refusing to obey, and for a brief, horrifying second, I thought I was going to disappear, to melt into the seat like the others, to become nothing, to become part of the car, part of the endless road, part of whatever nightmare I had stepped into. But then, I saw it. A small, flickering glow. A notification on my phone, still clenched in my shaking hand. A single message from an unknown number. Jump. And somehow, I knew. It was my only chance. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I stared at the glowing notification on my phone. Jump. The word burned into my mind, simple yet impossibly heavy, like an order from something beyond my understanding. The air around me felt thicker now, charged with something unnatural, a presence that didn't just exist in the car, it was the car. Every part of this twisted vehicle, from the flickering dashboard to the unnervingly smooth road, was a construct, an illusion, a cage built for something not human. My fingers tightened around my phone, sweat slipping between my knuckles, my instincts screaming that I only had seconds left. The driver's reflection in the mirror hadn't moved, but I could feel him shifting, feel his presence unfolding around me like a second skin, pressing against my own, trying to pull me deeper into whatever nightmare loop this was. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and then, something changed. The digital display on the dashboard glitched, the numbers on the ETA flickering erratically. 3 minutes. 10 minutes. 0 minutes. 9,999 minutes. The streetlights outside the window began blinking, but not in the way lights should. They flashed like frames of a corrupted video, distorting, looping, snapping into place at unnatural angles. My stomach churned as I watched the scenery shift subtly, then reset, as if the road was rebuilding itself over and over again. A deep, nauseating dread twisted inside me as realization sank its claws into my mind. I wasn't just in a car. I was inside something broken, something looping, something feeding off my presence. And the longer I stayed, the more of me it would take. My voice. My reflection. My body. My lungs clenched, panic clawing its way up my throat. I had to get out. No doors. No windows. No escape. But then, like a whisper in the back of my skull, I saw it, a moment. A flaw. A crack in the pattern. The streetlights glitched in sequence, but one, just one, flickered a second too late. A break in the loop. A window. An exit. My fingers curled around my seatbelt, my muscles tensed, my breath shuddering as I prepared myself for the only option left. The moment the next set of lights glitched, I threw my body forward. And I jumped. The car wasn't moving. The road wasn't real. And when I hit the ground, there was nothing beneath me. I plunged into the darkness, my body twisting, the sensation of falling stretching too long, too deep, too endless. My stomach lurched violently as I braced for the impact, but there was none. No hard pavement beneath me, no broken bones, no searing pain of my body colliding with the earth. Just nothing. The air around me felt dense, thick, like liquid night pressing against my skin, suffocating me, drowning me in a void that refused to let me go. My screams were swallowed before they could even leave my throat, trapped within me like my voice had been stolen, erased. And then, the world reset. I wasn't falling anymore. I was sitting. Back in the car. My breath came out in short, ragged gasps as my eyes darted wildly around, my fingers clawing at the seat beneath me, desperate for some kind of proof that I had moved, that I had escaped. But everything was the same. The sterile air. The perfectly still road. The driver with his hands locked on the wheel. My head jerked toward the dashboard, my vision blurring as I focused on the glowing screen. The ETA. 9,999 minutes. It hadn't changed. I hadn't left. Panic slammed into me like a freight train, my entire body trembling as I turned to the driver, my throat tightening so hard I could barely force the words out. I jumped. I wasn't here. My voice shook, my brain scrambling to piece together the nightmare I had just lived through. I had felt the air against my skin, seen the void open up beneath me, but now I was back, as if nothing had ever happened. My heartbeat pounded in my skull, a frantic, chaotic rhythm that only worsened when the driver moved. He turned his head toward me too fast, too smooth, the motion not human, not natural. The same black void of his eyes swallowed every flicker of light, a hungry abyss that mirrored something beyond existence. His mouth stretched, that wrong, lipless grin curling wider, splitting open as if his skin was nothing more than a fragile imitation of something trying to wear human form. Then, in my voice, he whispered, "You never left." I couldn't breathe. My limbs locked in place, my mind spiraling in terror as I turned toward the window, desperate for a way out, any way out. But what I saw outside made the breath in my lungs turn to ice. The road wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood on the sidewalk. Hundreds of them. All watching. All smiling. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the figures outside. They lined the streets like statues, dozens, no, hundreds of them, stretching far beyond what my eyes could comprehend. Their faces were too smooth, too stretched, their skin waxy under the flickering glow of the streetlights. Mouths too wide. Teeth too many. Eyes too hollow. Every single one of them was grinning, their heads tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. They weren't people. They were things, waiting, expecting something. A deep, pulsing dread crawled up my spine, my breath coming out in short, uneven gasps. I wasn't supposed to be here. The road, the car, the driver, they had all been a trap. And now, I was caught in something far worse. My shaking hand clutched my phone, desperate for a signal, for anything real, anything that could tell me I was still human, that I still existed. But the screen was blank. Just a black, pulsing void. Like the driver's eyes. A slow, creeping realization settled in my bones as I turned my gaze back to the driver. His grin had faded. He was looking forward again, hands still gripping the wheel, but something was different. Something I couldn't process at first, until I looked into the rearview mirror. I wasn't there anymore. My reflection was gone. A choked sound of horror clawed its way up my throat, but before I could even react, the car began to slow. The humming of the engine faded, the tires rolling over pavement that suddenly felt too real, too solid. We were stopping. We had reached our destination. The driver turned to me again, that sickening, rotting grin curling back onto his face, his hollow eyes shining with something ancient, something endless, something hungry. He lifted one bony hand, pointed toward the door. "You are home." The lock clicked. The door swung open. And outside, standing in the glow of the streetlight, was the next passenger. His face was familiar. Because it was mine.